Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberkaş. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan had blunt words for Sweden that the Nordic country shouldn't expect a green light anytime soon for its entry into NATO, even at next month's summit in Lithuania. Erdoğan made the remarks as officials from Turkey, Sweden, Finland and NATO met in Ankara to discuss Sweden's membership bid. The meeting ended without any guarantees for Sweden's entry, but that further talks would be held. Turkey approved Finland's entry into the alliance in March, but still objects to Sweden, citing the country's failure to crack down on terror groups operating on its soil. Meanwhile, on Monday, Germany opened NATO's largest air force drills in a show of unity that was clearly sending a message to Russia. Some 250 aircraft from 25 NATO and partner countries are participating in the exercises, including Turkey and Sweden. Dubbed Air Defender 23, the drills will run until June 23rd. To discuss Sweden's NATO bid and Turkey's security concerns, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Outzen. He's a former US diplomat. And from Istanbul, Helin Ertem. She is an associate professor at Istanbul Medeniyet University. Welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, Helin, as NATO carries out its largest air deployment exercise in history, Sweden's membership into the alliance hangs in the air. So what do you make of the latest situation? And is it really likely that Turkey will not approve Stockholm's membership bid during next month's summit in Lithuania?
Well, it depends because as we all observe, there is a kind of speeding up in the mutual relations and trilateral relations in between NATO, Sweden, Turkey, Finland as well. So there are lots of things going on in between all these centers, capitals. But at the same time, I think Sweden is also trying to do its best to satisfy Turkey's quite rightful security concerns. On this side, I think we should also take into consideration that Ukraine war is still going on. There's this huge exercise, military exercise in Germany. So NATO General Secretary is doing their best, and they are doing their best to satisfy Turkey's needs, and at the same time to underline that they need Germany, they need all other countries like Sweden and Finland inside the Union in order to somehow deter Russian aggression.
Mm-hmm. So, Rich, what do you think? Is Sweden really fulfilling its promises it made to Turkey? And why do you think Turkey remains opposed to the Nordic nations' membership into the alliance?
Well, I think they've made a good start. And the most important thing that happened at the end of last year was the change in the Swedish constitution and their basic laws to criminalize membership in terrorist organizations. Believe it or not, under previous Swedish law, it was illegal to conduct terrorist acts, violent acts on Swedish territory, but fundraising, propaganda, and simple membership was not grounds for arrest or for expulsion. So the change in those laws just took effect in June. Mm-hmm. And I think, honestly, it's going to take a little bit of time. They've had one early case with Mehmet Kokulu, I believe was the name, a guy who was extradited actually on drug charges, but is also a known PKK supporter and was wanted by Turkey on that grounds. But it's going to take weeks or months to demonstrate that this is not just a one-time exercise of a new legal right, but an actual determination on the part of Stockholm to treat the PKK as a foreign terrorist organization, which it is recognized by the United States and most of the European Union. So I think it's a good start. I don't think personally it's going to be enough before the Vilnius summit to convince Turkey that the problem is solved. But I think talks will continue and progress is being made.
So, Helin, what do you make of the latest protests in Sweden against Turkey and President Erdogan? Does it seem to you that these terror organizations and terror group sympathizers are trying to undermine Sweden's membership chances? And if so, what's at stake for them to hamper the country's membership chances?
Well, I think this is the classical dilemma between security and freedom. You know, if you focus too much on security, then there are concerns about freedom. And if you focus too much on freedom, then you have lacking points regarding security. For that reason, I do believe that as long as the Swedish government is trying to push hard to be a member of NATO, there will be such social protests coming, especially from the minority groups, from the refugees who became maybe Swedish citizens even. But there will be a reaction. This is a natural reaction because as I do also agree with Richard that it's very difficult to do things in a very short period of time. It will take time, and Sweden is doing its best in terms of changing its legal procedure. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that they can cut their relations with the so-called terror groups from every kind of origin inside their country. It will take time to persuade the people, both the Swedish people, naturally, but at the same time, the refugees, minority groups, NGOs, and so on.
So, Rich, do you see if there is a direct correlation between Sweden's membership into the alliance and the sale of F-16s to Turkey by the United States? Are those negotiations on both issues go hand in hand, or they're being treated separately?
Well, in a better world, they would be entirely separate. There would be a strategic logic driving partnership in defense industry, and then a separate logic about Swedish accession, and each decision made on its own merits. But in fact, important members of the United States Congress have drawn that linkage. And even President Biden has said, when asked about his congratulatory call to President Erdogan after his re-election, he said, well, we talked about Sweden. I told him we want Sweden in, and he talked about F-16. So that explicit linkage of the two is shared by people like Senator Menendez and Representative Meeks in the U.S. Congress, who have also said maybe Turkey gets F-16s, but at a minimum, they have to first let Sweden in. So this quid pro quo, of course, if we look at the history of U.S.-Turkish relations, is not generally a good way to do business. Because it indicates that there could be further demands. This could be sort of holding hostage Turkey's desire for F-16s. I want to just point out that as part of this exercise, in fact, Turkish F-16s are flying this week over Germany as part of NATO's deterrent against Russia. So hopefully this will indicate to those people that have this linkage in their mind that maybe it's a good idea on its own merits to keep Turkey flying as part of NATO's deterrent force.
So, Helin, why do you think Sweden's NATO membership is so vital to the United States, other than for confronting Russia?
They are trying, the United States at least is trying to build up the alliance from the very beginning. It was a kind of very huge damage given by the United States itself to the Union, because it was Trump administration which questioned NATO's existence, even Turkey's and Germany's presence in this alliance. For that reason, actually, it was the United States' fault to a greater extent, which started the path to question NATO's future. But at the same time, since the start of the Ukrainian war, we also see that the United States is in a great effort to repair the damage that was given to the alliance.
Yes. So, Rich, would you agree? Is it only Russia? Because I have this question for you. How would a Scandinavian peninsula under full NATO control impact Russia's and China's trade ties with the European countries moving forward?
Well, we've had long periods of time where the ties during the Cold War included military tensions and also what we might consider formal diplomacy continuing and trade continuing to a limited extent as well. There was not always a total blockage of trade between the two. So I think even when there's military tensions, that with both China and Russia, Europe and the United States can continue to do business, they can continue to trade. I think the desire to strengthen NATO's northern flank is reflective of the fact that we don't trust Putin, even while we're doing business with Putin, and that having gotten a taste for aggression in Georgia and in Ukraine, that he's allowed to do this, that smaller countries like the Baltic states and like Sweden and Finland, and it's less than a century since the last time the Soviet Union, including Russia, attacked Finland, right? So yes. I think this is a good hedge against aggression. In strategic terms, it makes sense. It's also reflective of the fact that the U.S. doesn't want to bear all the costs for European defense. Sweden is a country that has significant military industry, sort of like Turkey does. They make their own fighter planes. They've had armored vehicles and infantry weapons, things like that. And they actually have a fairly competent military. So this would enable the United States to have another partner in NATO that is a capable contributor. I also want to just take one small point of disagreement with Helin. I think the weakening of NATO sort of in the 2000s and the 2010s was not because of Trump or because, I mean, he said some unkind things, but what Trump was pointing out is that all the European countries were under contributing. Germany, first and foremost. I think Turkey was close to 2% of its GDP. The United States was over 2% of its GDP. But most of Europe took NATO for granted. They said the Russians are never coming. Even
Yes.
President Obama made fun of Mitt Romney in the 2000 and I guess it was 12 election cycle for implying that Russia was still a threat. So Trump was trying to wake NATO up. And of course, he did it in an inartful way. But I don't think that was the source of the problem. The source of the problem was we all misread Russian intent.
We also maybe should remember, like just a few years ago, France's President Macron called NATO brain dead. So, and Helin, very quickly, how has Russia's attack, because you mentioned it a lot, on Ukraine, which came a few years after Crimea's annexation, spurred NATO to revisit its policies and defenses? And are we likely to see a more deterrent NATO moving forward?
Well, we have to, otherwise there's no meaning of NATO. And I think there's one thing I should underline as a kind of response to Richard. In my point of view, it was the United States itself which weakened, somehow demilitarized Germany. They wanted such a kind of Germany in Europe. They wanted to build a kind of economic giant, but not a military giant. And finally, with the increasing potential of Russian aggression, they understood that they need more from the European side. But at the same time, they have to focus on South Asia to Asia Pacific regarding the rising China threat.
All right, Helin and Rich, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. I appreciate it a lot.